from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
You know, as we move into 2025, despite the many dangers that we face, there are reasons to be very, very hopeful, not just for Israel, but for the United States as well.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Victoria Coates, author of the new book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. We'll talk with Victoria in depth about that book a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Jeremiah Regan. He is Executive Director of Online Learning here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Regan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
We are always excited to launch a new online course, and this one is no exception. Totalitarian Novels is available now at hillsdale.edu/new course. You can sign up there. We'll tell you more about that in a minute. Why totalitarian novels? It sounds big and scary. So why do we want to do it, and what books do we discuss in this course?
It is big and scary, but it's also a lot of fun. The course examines 1984, Brave New World, Darkness at Noon, and That Hideous Strength. So we've got 4 of them in there, and they all show a little bit of a different perspective on totalitarianism. But what our students will come away with at the end of the course is a view that there is hope in courage and in the providence of our Lord.
So who's the teacher for this one? What's the format?
Hillsdale College President Dr. Larry Arnn presents a lecture and an analysis of each book, and then he sits down with students from his class, Hillsdale College undergraduates, who took this class with him in person, and discusses major themes, important passages, and because it's Dr. Arnn, has a little fun at their expense.
You'll learn a lot, of course, but it's worth the price of admission. Which is nothing, right?
That's right.
But it's worth that price to see Dr. Arnn interact with our students if you haven't seen that previously.
It's a blast.
Totalitarian novels. What do the novels covered in this course help to tell us? What can they tell us about the effect that tyranny can have on man?
Yeah. Tyranny is a very old form of government, and there's various definitions, but they all point toward one thing. That is political rule that is bad for those who are ruled. Tyranny is designed to aid those who are in charge, be it a king, an oligarchy, or even the majority in a democracy. What makes tyranny totalitarianism are modern tools, technology, the internet, weapons that can kill large numbers of people at one time. And Dr. Arnn brings this point out. Totalitarianism is, in a sense, the complete form of tyranny because it can work its way into every aspect of human life, including surveilling thoughts and ideas.
Hillsdale.edu/new course for this new one on totalitarian novels. Big picture, how might we contrast the approach of Orwell in 1984 and Huxley in Brave New World?
Well, Orwell and Huxley give us some insight into that because they exchanged correspondence on this very point. Orwell envisions a totalitarian regime that relies on fear and pain, inducing suffering to gain obedience and order. And really the aim in that regime is to compel people, and that's a fancy way of saying hurt them until they say, I love you. Where Huxley takes a totally different approach. He believes in a much more peaceful regime, a regime of ease, a totalitarian state that smothers and drowns people in pleasures, sexual pleasures, sensual pleasures, drugs, and keeps them content in consumerism, consumption, and our baser instincts. So these are two competing views of what can dissuade people from living a good and virtuous life, the kind of life we try to encourage our Hillsdale students, both on campus and in our online courses, to lead. These are ways of distracting and diverting people from the good life.
Dr. Jeremiah Regan with us, Executive Director of Online Learning at Hillsdale College. The new course on totalitarian novels. 1984 and Brave New World are 2 of them. Darkness at Noon is a 3rd novel. This might be the least known of the books in the course, but I know it's a favorite of Dr. Arnn's. What do you think that he sees in that book?
Well, in Darkness at Noon, we get the only fictional representation of an actual regime. 1984, Brave New World and That Hideous Strength imagine future totalitarian regimes. Darkness at Noon looks at what it was like living in Soviet Russia, what the experience of a party loyalist who has fallen into disfavor with the party would experience, and the inner turmoil that he has, recounting the actions he took on behalf of the party, the remorse he feels for those he hurt, and ultimately his submission to the will of the party, reflecting on spending his entire life devoted to this cause. He's not going to throw it away in the last moments of his life, and he accepts his unjust penalty.
The final novel is That Hideous Strength, which you just referenced, a C.S. Lewis book. Is this a place where perhaps we can find reason for hope inside the study of these totalitarian novels?
Yes, for several reasons. First, all four of the novels give us cause for hope. In 1984, Brave New World and Darkness at Noon, the regime is already in power by the time we catch up with the protagonists. We are not in a totalitarian regime of that sort, though there is a risk that we could be. So those three novels give us hope to prevent the domination of that totalitarian regime. In That Hideous Strength, we see a regime in its infancy, trying to gain traction, and I'm sorry to spoil it, but the book's been out for 70 years. They fail. It's also the only book, and Orwell criticized C.S. Lewis for bringing God into it, but it's the only book in which God plays a role. But that means it's the most realistic book, because we know that God superintends all human endeavors and is in control of this world and will ultimately have good triumph. So there's great hope in that. There's hope in less obvious ways too, though. The protagonists in That Hideous Strength seem to do normal, ordinary things, have conversations, garden, eat meals together, sing, pray. And it seems, in one sense, like they're not doing anything to resist the regime. But those actions, the normal functions of ordinary, pleasant life, are a rejection of totalitarianism. And through the practice of those normal, ordinary, and wholesome things, they develop courage, so when called upon, they're ready to resist.
When it comes to this topic, what's the advantage of studying fictional works as opposed to studying actual history?
Well, you should study both, and you can study totalitarianism in its modern instantiation in our Marxism, Communism, and Socialism course. But what studying in fiction does is it enlivens our imagination and helps us see the ways in which totalitarianism could subsume human life, the ways it could exert control that it hasn't yet. And it helps us imagine the ways in which we could resist it. It helps us imagine the type of lives that we should want to lead, totalitarian threat or not, so that we have a fruitful and satisfying life. And so it's the inspiration of creativity in the soul that fiction brings out.
Is it possible through this study in our totalitarian novels course to learn perhaps how we can help defend our society against a trend or a slide toward despotism?
Absolutely. And as I've hinted at, learning these novels, studying them, enjoying them, can help us develop awareness of the threat to our way of life, and it can therefore help us develop vigilance and courage so that we can prevent this type of regime from coming into power in the first place. It's much easier to prevent than it is to overthrow.
Talking with Dr. Jeremiah Regan, Executive Director of Online Learning here at Hillsdale College. The new course, Totalitarian Novels, at hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE. What are you most going to take away from putting this course together as you watch Dr. Arndt teach, as you watch him lecture, as you watch him interact with students, and maybe see it through the students' eyes as well, what they're picking up from this course?
I've had the great privilege and the great pleasure of learning directly from Dr. Arndt in my studies at Hillsdale College, but not these books. And so watching these young students, looking back at my situation 20 years ago and seeing them grasp concepts that generally only come through experience. And when we're talking about totalitarianism, that experience is often some form of suffering. Seeing them awaken and start to gain in vigilance, start to think, I need to look out for this. These things matter. I should pay a little bit of attention to politics and what's going on in my town and state and my nation. That was a blast. Plus, these books are, despite their dark themes, very well written and very fun. We always try to make sure that the professor is able to explain their view of the subject matter to the best of their ability, and they're the star. But in this course, we went further than we've ever gone with our set design to try to mimic in what meets the eye the quality and beauty of what is hitting the ear. So we had a lot of fun building the set and filming this course.
If people have taken our online courses before, this particular one on totalitarian novels is going to be a little different in terms of how it's released, at least at the beginning. Tell people what they should expect.
Yeah, if you're familiar with streaming services, you know there's two models: release all the episodes at once or release them episode by episode. We've used the release all at once model up to this point, but this course in particular is really gripping and engaging, and we want to keep the students hankering for more. So we're releasing each episode Tuesdays and Thursdays, kind of like a college course schedule, until all of them have released. Of course, anyone who is in our early access pool or who donates to support the course will have access to all episodes immediately.
Hillsdale.edu/new course to sign up. Hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE. Totalitarian Novels with Dr. Larry Arnn and Hillsdale students. Dr. Jeremiah Regan, Executive Director of Online Learning here at Hillsdale College. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks, Scott.
Up next, Victoria Coates joins us. We'll talk about her recent book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15th, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. We're joined by Victoria Coates. She is Vice President of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, also the author of the recent book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us.
Scott, it's good to be with you and all my friends at Hillsdale.
I like when authors do part of the work for me, that the book is broken up into 4 wonderful quadrants, which we can discuss. But the very first question is, how did we get here? And here certainly also implies what happened October 7th and the aftermath of October 7th of 2023. How do we get to a point where we see that this terror attack in Israel, and what happens next?
Well, that's very much the reason that I wrote The Battle for the Jewish State as the shock of October 7th, 2023 kind of wore off through the subsequent spring of last year. I felt like I kept being asked the same questions by a wide range of people, most of whom were instinctively at least neutral toward Israel, if not supportive, who simply didn't understand what was going on, who grasped the just horrors of the original attack, but then also were befuddled that within hours, not days, but within hours, the pro-Hamas factions were on the streets, and they weren't on the streets in Riyadh and Cairo. They were on the streets in New York and London and Los Angeles. And then within days, the protests erupted across American campuses. And that the young people in America were revealed to be so aggressively, not just anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, but also pro-Hamas, and creating this whole new little radical chic movement with their masks and their keffiyehs, and the whole vogue for taking down American flags in places like Harvard Square and hoisting Palestinian flags, all of which was accepted by the universities, who accommodated them. And the fact that so many of the protesters were from outside the universities, but were given the right to create encampments, to disrupt classes, to disrupt exams. It just that was extraordinary. And so the first chapter of the book gets into why all this goes on. I know this is not a disease that besets Hillsdale, but it does beset the vast majority of the other institutions in this country, and it's something I think we have to deal with.
We saw something I think utterly left my mouth agape as Kamala Harris was considering vice presidential nominees, running mates. You always have, this person, here's pluses, here's a minus. And as Josh Shapiro's name was in those conversations, almost everywhere when you saw a list of minuses, essentially it said minus, he's Jewish, which explained a lot about how the left was approaching the topic, explained a lot about how the Democratic base was fracturing in some ways over this incident. Do you see that kind of approach continuing on the left in this country in the years to come?
No, it's very, very real. And, my old boss, Senator Ted Cruz, I was very honored, he wrote the foreword to the book, and he wrote about the testimony of the three college presidents in December of 2023, when Elise Stefanik really broke onto the national stage by grilling them to call the systematic targeting of Jews genocide, and they wouldn't do it. And what it sort of pointed out to me is that this then becomes a political problem for the left, because if you look at the demographics of the folks who elected Joe Biden in 2020 and prevented the red wave in 2022, that is disproportionately the youth vote. That's the 18 to 29-year-olds. And they are the ones, as I said, that are disproportionately at this point anti-Semitic, because this is what they're being taught, primarily in college, but it's also present in high school curricula as well, that Israel is illegitimate, that state is, regardless of its method of government, imperial and racist and illegal. And so, that is a problem then for the Democrats, because if that be true, and it is, they need that vote. A lot of people talked in the 2024 lead up to that election about the Arab American vote in some counties in Michigan. That was dwarfed by the problem they had with the youth vote. And I think that really drove Harris's decision. I'm actually from Pennsylvania. We were happy about it because Shapiro's very, very talented, and I think would have been a great contributor to that ticket the way Waltz was not. But I was at a Jewish community event for Dave McCormick the day that happened, and with John Thune, now the Senate Majority Leader. And I think John and Dave and I were the only people in the room who weren't Jewish. And it was literally an hour after that decision had come out. And the response in the room was really shock, because everybody knew the whole reason he wasn't picked was because he was Jewish. And that came as deeply chilling to that community. The folks who were in that room tended to be conservative anyway, but not all of them. Many of them were just there because they were interested, in the race. But to a man and to a woman, everybody, it was very chilled about what it said about the politics of anti-Semitism in America.
Victoria Coates with us, her new book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. I feel like we need to talk a bit about the UNRWA and what it stands for, what they do, why are they pulled into this conflict. Israel, I believe, has declared that a terror organization. And then you go to the UNRWA's website and it says, "Stop Israel's violent campaign against us." How does the UNRWA get in the middle of all this?
Well, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, as that nasty acronym is pronounced, was bespoke created for the Palestinians. All the rest of the world's refugees are under the UN High Council for Refugees. But in 1948, when Israel was created, the UNRWA was also created as the specific vehicle for international aid to flow to the Palestinians. And it has grown into the primary ostensible provider of civil services to the Palestinians. None of those institutions have ever been developed from within by the Palestinians for schools, for hospitals, for law courts, for anything along those lines. All of that has been provided by UNRWA. And by far and away, the largest donor to UNRWA has been the United States, to the tune of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars have been poured into this. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there have been people of good conscience who have tried to work for UNRWA and do good things for the Palestinian people. But unfortunately, the terrorist elements, both in West Bank and in Gaza, have completely infiltrated it. And this was quite viciously revealed on October 7th when card-carrying UNRWA employees participated in the attacks. And on top of that, then many, many more of them were complicit in the hostage holding. These are folks who allowed weapons to be stored in schools and hospitals, who turned a blind eye to Hamas having offices in schools and hospitals, putting obviously children at risk, but they could care less about that. And then also, I think perhaps most viciously, participating in the indoctrination of those children, because those 1,500 seasoned Hamas terrorists who led the charge on October 7th all attended UNRWA schools. And it's hard, Scott, to make 1,500 people be that savage at one time. You know, these are people with smartphones. These are people who watch TikTok, but they, at the same time are getting this in their schools to not try to come to an accommodation with Israel, not try to make a deal with Israel, but to try to eradicate Israel.
Victoria Coates with us, her book, The Battle for the Jewish State, the second portion of the book. Why is Israel the partner of choice for the United States in the Middle East? The security partnership between the U.S. and Israel, does it work in our favor? There are some critics who would say, our partnership actually puts us in more danger. If we weren't connected, we would not be pulled into Israel's fights. How does the U.S.-Israel partnership actually keep us safer?
Now, this is a really important question, and a lot of the foreign policy elites, in particularly here in the swamp in Washington, will be very dismissive of the American people when they have the gall to ask that very question. This is something that's very far away from us, from our daily lives. Why should we invest billions of dollars into it? And why should we potentially link our security to it? And so I think it is beholden on those of us who do value the relationship, who do think that investment is worthwhile, to explain in terms that make sense why this is. And what we've seen over the last 76 years of Israel's existence is the transformation of a tiny, almost untenable, attacked state, made up largely of refugees from Europe, but from other places as well, increasingly refugees from across the Middle East, where Jews were being persecuted, come together to form what's now one of the top 20 most powerful nations in the world. And that transformation, a lot of which has taken place during my lifetime, I hate to date myself this way, but when I was born, Israel was 20 years old and in the midst of a series of potentially existential wars with Arab nation states, and it's now 76. and that makes me old enough to have a daughter who's a senior at Hillsdale. We're very fortunate about, but what I've seen over my life is that transformation of Israel and the security partnership, which was actually codified under President Reagan. It's one of Reagan's unsung achievements. He was very focused on the Cold War, so less engaged on Middle East issues. But under Reagan, we had both the first Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, between Israel and the United States. We're currently negotiating another one that would go into effect in 2026 and 2028. He codified the intelligence sharing relationship, but then also the first free trade agreement the United States signed was with Israel during the Reagan era. So this was always a relationship that had both an economic and security component. And as Israel has developed, and one of the great themes of the book that I found most fascinating, and it gave the book its cover, is missile defense. And when Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, in 1983, the words he used could have been, uttered by any Israeli prime minister, that we are going to preempt them from attacking. Nobody ever went to war with something called missile defense. And then that cooperation over the decades has now led that a candidate for President Trump, saying on the campaign trail that he wants to put an Iron Dome, which is the name of Israel's proprietary missile defense system, over all of America. So that has been enormously productive. And as somebody who's worked, on U.S.-Israel policy from the inside, I can just tell you that what goes on in the intelligence sharing sphere is unparalleled. And it does keep Americans safe every day.
I talked with George Gilder recently about the reissue of his book, The Israel Test, and something that is in that book that also features in The Battle for the Jewish State, this idea of the innovation of Israel and how it benefits the U.S. So why does this partnership not just make our lives safer, but make our lives also better?
Oh, it does in so many different ways. And this is one of many things the United States and Israel have in common. One is innovation of our respective populations is a national security treasure. And it's something that totalitarian regimes stamp out. Not that it's impossible for their populations, but it's impossible under their current leadership. So you have, Russia with very little in terms of innovation. You have China, stealing intellectual property around the globe, but particularly from the United States and Israel, because they don't develop it in their own people. And, Israel, a country of 9 million people, has won an extraordinary number of, I'd have to look it up in the battle for the Jewish state, but Nobel Prizes in the sciences. And one of the things the people who are opposed to the boycott, sanctions, and divestiture movement, which is supposed to isolate Israel, is like, well, you can do that, but you're going to have to stop doing things like using an iPhone. And you're going to have to stop doing things like using a GPS app like Waze. And you're going to have to stop eating cherry tomatoes, because those are all Israeli inventions. So communicating, moving around, eating, these are things you might have to give up if you decide you want to espouse BDS. And it's amazing how quickly that shuts them down. But, this is a huge strength. And the more we partner with them, I mean, it's just recently been announced that NVIDIA, even with the state of war that's going on, is investing another $500 million in an AI research center in northern Israel. Even with the threats, even with the security environment, it is worth it to NVIDIA to make that kind of an investment in Israel, because that's where the innovation is.
Victoria, the third section, is there an alternative? And I was reading your description of President Obama and his pivot to Iran, and in particular, the green movement that sprang up in Iran. And many Americans were curious why more wasn't done to support the green movement in its effort to change, to enact hope and change in Iran. What happened there? Why was Obama and the administration so hesitant to move?
No, it was curious living through it at the time. And the Green Movement, the revolutionary movement in 2009 in Iran, really sprang into action right after the Obama inauguration, I think, because the people of Iran were hopeful that Obama would be supportive of them. And certainly it would seem from the outside to be on brand for him. But what was less known now, and I go through in the battle for the Jewish state, is that he had already made his mind up that the way to peace in the Middle East was to reject the Bush-era policy of no daylight between the United States and Israel. His argument publicly made was that that had not led to peace, so he was going to draw back from the Jewish state, and that he would look for offsetting alternatives. And for him, it was Iran. And so that's the answer to the question, what are the alternatives? I mean, there are two. There's the Palestinians and there's the Iranians. And there have been bipartisan attempts to reach out to the Palestinians to elevate them into something that they're not, which is a nation state. But Obama was unique in thinking that revolutionary Iran would be somehow a legitimate partner to the United States. And once they had made that decision, which I think was made before they came into office, the prospects of revolution in Iran were very inconvenient. And so he deliberately withheld help, even as the people on the streets of Tehran cried out, as they were shot, as they were abducted, as they were tortured. He said nothing, and then embarked on the journey that became the Obama-era nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Course of Action, the JCPOA. What that actually means, I don't know. Nobody's ever explained it to me, but that was their goal, and by hook or by crook, by the end of his second term, they got it.
Victoria Coates with us, her book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. The final section, what's next? And to know what's next, we look back a little bit to the first Trump administration and the Abraham Accords, which are often referenced but perhaps not fully understood. What were the Abraham Accords, and why was it such a step forward for the region?
No, it really was the signature extraordinary achievement of President Trump's first term. And as we embark on his second term this year, I think that they hope is that we will return to peace rather than the 15 months of war that we've been through recently. And what President Trump did, he really laid it out in his AIPAC speech in 2016 that he was going to return to a policy of no daylight with Israel. And we were given another kind of guideline on the National Security Council staff during that period, which was no surprises, that we kept our Israeli colleagues thoroughly informed. They kept us informed. It allowed us to deal with problems in private, not on the pages of the New York Times, which turned out to be a better policy in hindsight. And I think, what then the actions that President Trump took, and it's important to remember these were his decisions. And these are things like moving the embassy at long last from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, establishing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So establishing certainty around Israel's borders and topography, that was critically important. And then finally, in January of 2020, taking a very strong action against Iran by ordering the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the elite Quds force in the IRGC, responsible for the death of many Americans as recently as a few weeks before his elimination. And that then changed the mindset of our Arab partners. And following that, over the course of 2020, culminating in September, we were able to get to deals with major Muslim-majority countries, UAE and Bahrain, and then shortly thereafter, Morocco, in these very important Abraham Accords deals, which, yes, had a security component, like the ones from quarter century before with Jordan and even further back with Egypt, which were exclusively security. But with the Abraham Accords, there was also an economic component to them. And one of the things that's been the most hopeful to me over the last 15 months is that those accords have endured, and the commercial cooperation between the countries has even increased, even during the war. So I think those policies are what I recommend we get back to. There are ways you could expand them, expand Israel's integration into the security architecture of the Middle East in the Trump second term that I think would be great for the region and also great for the United States.
Final question for Victoria Coates, her book, The Battle for the Jewish State. We have, at the moment, Victoria, this very tentative ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Of course, there was a ceasefire in effect on October 7th as well. We have President Trump taking the White House, President Trump, for the next 4 years, a president who likely won't be withholding weapons or placing embargo on what can go to Israel in their fight. How do you think those two factors change at all the calculus in the region in the next few years?
Oh, I'm hopeful that it's going to be a massive change, because along with not withholding arms to Israel, the thing that President Trump will withhold once again is funding for the Palestinians. The Biden administration has doled out, I think, close to $2 billion at this point to the Palestinians over their term. That is funding President Trump froze in the first year of his first term. I think he's going to freeze it again and cut off those funds. And more importantly, even than that, cut off funds for the Iranians. He's announced that they're going to be looking at returning to the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. That's critically important. Starve them of funds. They don't have money to send to Hamas and Hezbollah, because if you do let them sell 1.7 million barrels a day of oil to China, they spend that money on their nuclear program and terrorist proxies. They do not spend it on the Iranian people. They do not spend it on curing cancer, as John Kerry assured us in 2015. And so I think, as we move into 2025, despite the many dangers that we face, there are reasons to be very, very hopeful, not just for Israel, but for the United States as well.
Victoria Coates, the book, The Battle for the Jewish State, How Israel and America Can Win. Victoria is the vice president of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thank you, Scott.
Up next, Dr. Eric Hutchinson from Hillsdale's Classics Department talks to us about Augustine and classical culture. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to find us on X for updated show and guest information. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Dr. Eric Hutchinson, who is Associate Professor of Classics and Chairman of our Collegiate Scholars Program here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Hutchinson, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Conversation today about Augustine and classical culture. We begin by asking you for a very brief biographical sketch of Augustine. Why are we even talking about him today?
Augustine is one of the most significant figures that we have in either Greek or Roman or Christian antiquity. So he's possibly the most, or one of the most influential figures whose works we have. We have more of him than almost anyone, maybe than anyone. I don't know for certain, but there are over 5 million words of Augustine that survive, which is an enormous amount. There aren't really any of the other sort of big folks that you've heard of, Homer, Virgil, Cicero. None of these folks even come. We have a lot of Cicero, but none of these folks come close to the amount of Augustine that we have. So just in terms of sheer output alone is impressive, but the quality of the work that survives is what makes it truly significant. Augustine straddles the 4th and 5th centuries AD, born in 354, and dies as Germanic tribes are sort of bearing down on the city of Hippo, where he was bishop in North Africa. Augustine was from Roman North Africa, modern-day Algeria, and spent part of his life in Italy, but most of it in Roman North Africa in the province of Numidia. Started out his professional career as a teacher of rhetoric. Then after his conversion or reconversion to Christianity, became first was hoping to live a sort of monastic life, but then was ordained to the priesthood and eventually to the bishopric, and then spent the remaining decades of his life as a bishop in the city of Hippo, also in Roman North Africa.
So among those 5 million words that we have, what kind of classical literary forms or styles are evident in his writings?
Surprisingly, not too many. The big genre that most listeners will probably be familiar with that Augustine employed is found in the part of his surviving work that's maybe among the least read, or certainly the lesser read parts of his output. Early in his literary career after his conversion to Christianity, Augustine wrote a number of philosophical dialogues in the style broadly of Cicero's philosophical dialogues on subjects like the happy life. So he takes up a number of topics in sort of classical philosophy and liberal education. After that, there aren't a lot of works that I would sort of characterize generically as particularly classical. However, as I mentioned a moment ago, Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric and was a highly accomplished orator himself, which really is evident in his preaching. There are hundreds of sermons of Augustine that survive. And he also wrote sort of theoretically and didactically on the subject of rhetoric, and specifically Christian rhetoric. So the classical oratorical tradition is something that comes through very strongly in a wide variety of his writings. But at the same time, he was an innovator. So the most famous work of Augustine now is the Confessions. That's the one people are most likely to read. And there aren't really antecedents for what he does there. There are some sort of partial antecedents, like the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Roman emperor, but it is sui generis. It's a new sort of hybrid literary genre that Augustine more or less invents. And so the way that classical influence comes through in Augustine's writings is in other kinds of ways, rather than through the imitation of form in particular.
What role did Augustine see for classical culture within a Christian society?
That's a good question. And the answer to that varies depending on both when in his life we're talking about and what kind of classical culture we're referring to in particular. Early in his life, again, he wrote this set of philosophical dialogues that are very self-consciously classicizing. Later in his life, he seems kind of irritated that he did that, though, and wants to be a lot more, I think, reticent about the degree to which he sort of endorses, classical culture as a whole. You read something like the early books of the Confessions, and you think about Roman education in particular and the type of education to which he was subject. He's very down on it and very critical of it. At the same time, there is a praiseworthy status accorded to particular strains of ancient philosophy that he makes use of and talks about in very complimentary ways. And implicitly, there are sort of modes of thought and expression throughout the Confessions and elsewhere that are clearly influenced by classical models like Virgil, for example, even when he is sort of on the surface of the text being critical of something like Virgil's Aeneid. So it's a really complicated and for that reason fascinating subject, because the way in which classical influences play out in the works of Augustine is highly variegated.
Talking with Dr. Eric Hutchinson about Augustine and classical culture. How did his writings contribute to both the preservation and transformation of classical knowledge during the Middle Ages?
I think we can talk about that in a couple of different ways. Augustine wrote in the 390s an unfinished work called in Latin De Doctrina Christiana, or on Christian teaching, and this is the work in which he kind of develops a theory of Christian rhetoric, and it's where the famous image of plundering the Egyptians comes from, which many listeners may have come across before. This idea that as the Israelites, when they were departing from Egypt, took the gold and silver of the Egyptians and used it for their own purposes, so Christians are able to do the same with sort of secular learning or classical learning, and that provides at least a kind of warrant for making some use of ancient thought. Maybe the biggest way, though, that the Augustinian legacy, especially in the centuries that follow in the Middle Ages, sort of carries through large elements of the classical tradition, is through the City of God, which was widely read in the Middle Ages and is extremely long. And in its immense length, there are references to quotations of exegeses of arguments against a wide variety of historical, literary, and philosophical sources from the ancient world. And many famous sort of bits, and Augustine's interpretation of those bits, are transmitted through the City of God, and in that way make their way into medieval thought more broadly. And all of that is to say nothing of his theological influence, which is immense in subsequent centuries. He's the most important figure from the Western Christian world for the entirety of the Middle Ages. So that's a separate conversation. But I would say, particularly through the City of God, which is itself a really elaborate, highly wrought sort of work of rhetoric. So even stylistically, a lot of classical rhetoric is preserved just in the way that Augustine writes in the City of God. But then there are all of these sort of source texts that come with it into the Middle Ages.
Talking with Dr. Eric Hutchinson from the Classics Department here at Hillsdale College about Augustine and classical culture. You told us a bit about City of God earlier, mentioned Confessions there. What is it about Confessions that endures? Why is it still so widely read? And how does Augustine address classical culture inside of there?
I think the Confessions is so widely read now because it strikes readers as modern in a way that a lot of other works from the ancient world don't. Augustine in the Confessions is concerned with examining his own interior life in a way that we don't really see very often at all in ancient writers. His hopes, his fears, right? His regrets, all these kinds of things that you have a sense that a real person is speaking to you from the other side of the page that can be difficult sometimes to find in a lot of ancient writers, in part because that's not really what they're interested in sort of putting forward some, an explicitly personal voice that's telling you about themselves. But Augustine is, though not for its own sake, the Confessions is in many respects a long prayer. So he's talking to God, and this is one way in which we can kind of see him tweaking the ancient genre of the dialogue. It is a sort of dialogue where he speaks to God, and we get all of these words from Augustine to God. And the way that God answers him back in the Confessions is through all the sort of quotations of and allusions to the Bible that occur throughout the work. So it is a kind of dialogue which Augustine wants to be used by others as a model for their own conversions and for their own turning to God. The way that we see classical material specifically is through the way that he discusses his early education, through the use that he makes of what he, again, calls the books of the Platonists. There's an important passage where he talks about his conversion to philosophy, where he reads a now lost work of Cicero, which is an exhortation to the philosophical life, that he basically says, sets his hair on fire. He doesn't refer to his hair in particular, but that's the kind of thing that he's speaking of there. We see it even in, to connect this back to what I was saying a moment ago about sort of the complex way that classical pagan sources enter into the Confessions. There's this moment when a friend of his dies, and he's talking about his grief over the death of his friend, and he refers to his friend as the dimidium animae, the half of his soul. And that's actually a quotation from a poem that the Roman poet Horace wrote about a voyage that Virgil was taking, saying, don't let him die, bring back the half of my soul alive and everything. So that's a spot where we can see, despite whatever surface criticism Augustine is often is leveling at writers like Virgil or ancient poets, it still has affected his thought in such a way that when his own close friend dies, what he sort of almost instinctively, it seems, reaches for is this bit from a poem hundreds of years old that expresses really that sort of essential nature of friendship.
You mentioned his vast influence in the theological world, so let me close by asking about that. How did he influence subsequent Christian thinkers? How is he viewed now by modern scholars and theologians?
Augustine's influence on subsequent theologians, writers, philosophers is about as vast as his own literary output. I mentioned before that he's easily the most important ancient Christian writer in the entirety of the Middle Ages, but that's also true of the Reformation, and that continues to be true now. I suspect more books are written, when we're thinking specifically of ancient figures, more books are going to be written on Augustine and Augustinian thought now than probably any other figure from the ancient world. This is the case both on specific or technical issues of theology, so Trinitarian theology, for example, and on these more personal questions about things like prayer, how the self relates to God. As I mentioned before, he does strike, especially in the Confessions, does strike readers as sort of peculiarly modern in a way that most other ancient writers don't. And so that, even what you might want to call that sort of almost existential dimension of life as it's actually lived, the Christian life as it's actually lived, I think continues to have a lot of, to speak very powerfully to readers now across time and space. And I think that's a testament to the fact that in Augustine, we really are dealing with the sort of rarest of figures whose thought and personality are so capacious that almost everyone sees some aspect of himself in him, or feels as if he's being addressed by this, in certain ways, very alien figure from a very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I think that's why he continues and will continue to exercise an attraction for readers from a variety of backgrounds.
Dr. Eric Hutchinson, Associate Professor of Classics and Chairman of our Collegiate Scholars Program at Hillsdale College. We talk about Augustine and classical culture. Dr. Hutchinson, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me on.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Jeremiah Regan, Victoria Coates, and Eric Hutchinson. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.